of that country air, in whom they did in succeeding times lay such a heavy yoke, that the very brutes were more happy than they, to which two species of tyranny as subalternate things to the genus, the other innumerable courses they took to extirpate and make this a desolate people may be reduced and referred. Now the ultimate end and scope that incited the Spaniards to endeavor the extirpation and desolation of this people was gold only, that thereby growing opulent in a short time they might arrive at once at such degrees and dignities as were no ways consistent with their persons. Finally, in one word, their ambition and avarice, than which the heart of man never entertained greater, and the vast wealth of those regions, the humility and patience of the inhabitants, which made their approach to these lands more facile and easy, did much promote the business, whom they so despicably contemned, that they treated them, I speak of things which I was an eyewitness of without the least fallacy, not as beasts, which I cordially wish they would, but as the most abject dung and filth of the earth, and so solicitous they were of their life and soul, that the above mentioned number of people died without understanding the true faith or sacraments. And this also is as really true as the precedent narration, which the very tyrants and cruel murderers cannot deny without the stigma of a lie, that the Spaniards never received any injury from the Indians, but that they rather reverenced them as persons descended from heaven, until that they were compelled to take up arms, provoked thereunto by repeated injuries, violent torments, and unjust butcheries. End of section 1. Section 2 of A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arnie Hort. A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas, translator unknown. Section 2 of the Island Hispaniola. In this isle, which, as we have said, the Spaniards first attempted, the bloody slaughter and destruction of men first began, for they violently forced away women and children to make them slaves, and ill-treated them, consuming and wasting their food, which they had purchased with great sweat, toil, and yet remained dissatisfied too, which every one according to his strength and ability, and that was very inconsiderable, for they provided no other food than what was absolutely necessary to support nature, without superfluity freely bestowed on them, and one individual Spaniard consumed more victuals in one day than would serve to maintain 3 families a month, every one consisting of 10 persons. Now being oppressed by such evil usage, and afflicted with such great torments and violent entertainment, they began to understand that such men as those had not their mission from heaven, and therefore some of them concealed their provisions, and others to their wives and children in lurking holes, but some, to avoid the obdurate and dreadful temper of such a nation, sought their refuge on the craggy tops of mountains, for the Spaniards did not only entertain them with cuffs, blows, and wicked cudgeling, but laid violent hands also on the governors of cities, and this arrived at length to that height of temerity and impudence, that a certain captain was so audacious as abused the consort of the most puissant king of the whole isle. From which time they began to consider by what ways and means they might expel the Spaniards out of their country, and immediately took up arms. But, good God, what arms, do you imagine? Namely, such, both offensive and defensive, as resemble reeds wherewith boys sport with one another, more than manly arms and weapons, which the Spaniards no sooner perceived, but they, mounted on generous steeds, well weaponed with lances and swords, begin to exercise their bloody butcheries and stratagems, and overrunning their cities and towns, spared no age or sex, nay, not so much as women with child, but ripping up their bellies, tore them alive in pieces. They laid wagers among themselves, who should with a sword at one blow cut or divide a man in two, or which of them should decollate or behead a man with the greatest dexterity, nay, farther, which should sheath his sword in the bowels of a man with the quickest dispatch and expedition. They snatched young babes from the mothers' breasts, and then dashed out the brains of those innocents against the rocks. Others they cast into rivers, scoffing and jeering them, and called upon their bodies, when falling, with derision, the true testimony of their cruelty, to come to them, and inhumanly exposing others to their merciless swords, together with the mothers that gave them life. They erected certain gibbets, large but low made, so that their feet almost reached the ground, every one of which was so ordered as to bear 13 persons, in honor and reverence, as they said blasphemously, of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, under which they made a fire to burn them to ashes whilst hanging on them. But those they intended to preserve alive, they dismissed, their hands half cut and still hanging by the skin, to carry their letters missive to those that fly from us and lie skulking on the mountains, as an exprobation of their flight. The lords and persons of noble extract were usually exposed to this kind of death. They ordered gridirons to be placed and supported with wooden forks, and putting a small fire under them, these miserable wretches by degrees, and with loud shrieks and exquisite torments, at last expired. I once saw 4 or 5 of their most powerful lords laid on these gridirons, and thereon roasted, and not far off 2 or 3 moreover spread with the same commodity, man's flesh. But the shrill clamors which were heard there being offensive to the captain, by hindering his repose, he commanded them to be strangled with a halter. The executioner, whose name and parents at Seville are not unknown to me, prohibited the doing of it, but stopped gags into their mouths to prevent the hearing of the noise, he himself making the fire, till that they died, when they had been roasted as long as he thought convenient. I was an eyewitness of these and innumerable number of other cruelties, and because all men, who could lay hold of the opportunity, sought out lurking holes in the mountains, to avoid as dangerous rocks so brutish and barbarous a people, strangers to all goodness, and the extirpators and adversaries of men, they bred up such fierce hunting dogs as would devour an Indian like a hog at first sight in less than a moment. Now such kind of slaughters and cruelties as these were committed by the curs, and if at any time it happened, which was rarely, that the Indians, irritated upon a just account, destroyed or took away the life of any Spaniard, they promulgated and proclaimed this law among them, that 100 Indians should die for every individual Spaniard that should be slain. End of section 2. Section 3 of a brief account of the destruction of the Indies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arnie Horton. A brief account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas. Translator unknown. Section 3 of the kingdoms contained in Hispaniola. This isle of Hispaniola was made up of 6 of their greatest kingdoms, and as many most puissant kings, to whose empire almost all the other lords, whose number was infinite, did pay their allegiance. One of these kingdoms was called Mantua, signifying a campaign or open country, which is very observable if any place in the universe deserves taking notice of, and memorable for the pleasantness of its situation, for it is extended from south to north 80 miles, in breadth 5, 8, and in some parts 10 miles in length. and is on all sides enclosed with the highest mountains. Above 30,000 rivers and rivulets water her coasts, 12 of which prodigious number do not yield in all in magnitude to those famous rivers, the Eber, Dour, and Guadalquivir, and all those rivers which have their source or spring from the mountains lying westerly, the number whereof is 20,000, are very rich in mines of gold, on which mountain lies the province of rich mines, whence the exquisite gold of 24 carats weight takes denomination. The king and lord of this kingdom was named Guarionex, who governed within the compass of his dominion so many vassals and potent lords that every one of them was able to bring into the field 16,000 soldiers for the service of Guarionex, their supreme lord and sovereign, when summoned thereunto, some of which I was acquainted with. This was a most obedient prince, endued with great courage and morality, naturally of a pacific temper, and most devoted to the service of the Castilian kings. This king commanded and ordered his subjects that every one of those lords under his jurisdiction should present him with a bell full of gold, but in succeeding times, being unable to perform it, they were commanded to cut it in two, and fill one part therewith, for the inhabitants of this isle were altogether inexperienced and unskillful in mine works, and the digging gold out of them. This Cayo preferred his service to the king of Castile, on this condition, that he would take care that those lands should be cultivated and mannered, wherein, during the reign of Isabella, Queen of Castile, the Spaniards first set footing and fixed their residence, extending in length even to Santo Domingo, the space of 50 miles. For he declared, nor was it a fallacy, but an absolute truth, that his subjects understood not the practical use of digging in golden mines, to which promises he had readily and voluntarily condescended, to my own certain knowledge, and so by this means the king would have received the annual revenue of 3 millions of Spanish crowns, and upward, there being at that very time in that island 50 cities more ample and spacious than Seville itself in Spain. But what returns by way of remuneration and reward did they make to this so clement and benign monarch? Can you imagine? No other but this: they put the greatest indignity upon him imaginable in the person of his consort, who was violated by a Spanish captain altogether unworthy of the name of Christian. He might indeed probably expect to meet with a convenient time and opportunity of revenging this ignominy so unjuriously thrown upon him by preparing military forces to attack him, but he rather chose to abscond in the province de los Cinquayos, wherein a puissant vassal and subject of his ruled, divested of his estate and kingdom, and there live and die an exile. But the Spaniards, receiving certain information that he had absented himself, connived no longer at his concealment, but raised war against him, who had received them with so great humanity and kindness, and having first laid waste and desolate the whole region, at last found and took him prisoner, who, being bound in fetters, was conveyed on board of a ship in order to his transportation to Castile as a captive, but the vessel perished in the voyage, wherewith many Spaniards were also lost, as well as a great weight of gold, among which there was a prodigious ingot of gold, resembling a large loaf of bread, weighing 3,600 crowns. Thus it pleased God to revenge their enormous impieties. A second kingdom was named Marion, where there is to this day a haven upon the utmost borders of the plain or open country toward the north, more fertile and large than the kingdom of Portugal, and really deserving constant and frequent inhabitants, for it abounds with mountains and is rich in mines of gold